So today we have Esteban Rodofili, who studied biology as an undergraduate at the University of Buenos Aires and did his master's in public policy at the Torcuato de Tella University, also in Buenos Aires. He started his PhD at the Interdisciplinary Ecology program here at UF in 2019. With a concentration in fisheries and aquatic sciences, his research has been focused on the automated detection of marine mammals in satellite and drone images, and his future application to the study of migration routes and the establishment of marine protected areas. And he was advised by Dr. Vincent McClure and Dr. Edward Camp. He integrates the International Whaling Commission's intersessional group, Satellites to Study Whales. During his PhD, he also received the Cynthia Melnick and Robin E. Nadeau awards, as well as the Grinter Fellowship, integrated for the International Student Council and covered the United Nations COP27 meeting for the Campus Climate Corps. He graduated in summer 2023 and has been selected as a 2024 finalist for the NOWS Fellowship's legislative branch to be placed in the U.S. Congress to assist in issues pertaining coastal and marine environmental policy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure. So let's start right away. My dissertation was named Semi-Automated Analysis of Satellite and Drone Imagery to Inform Marine Mammal Detection, Migration Route Studies, and Marine Protected Area Design. So marine mammals suffer even after the end of large-scale commercial whaling from different anthropogenic threats, including ship strikes and entanglement with fishing gear. So in this context, surveying efforts are particularly important to inform conservation measures. Such surveys have traditionally been carried out either from land or from crewed airplanes and ships. However, crewed aerial and vessel platforms can bias the results because of the animals' reactions to them. They can be dangerous to researchers, expensive, and logistically challenging in remote areas. In this context, satellite images of sub-meter spatial resolution and drone imageries of centimeter or sub-centimeter resolution allow detecting marine mammals in remote areas with less or no risks to researchers and less or no disturbance to wildlife. Nevertheless, a disadvantage common to remote sensing analysis is that manual counts of animals have been found to be extremely labor and time intensive. There is perhaps no better example than that of LaRue et al. 2020 and 2021. They managed to conduct a satellite image survey of the entirety of the Antarctic population of whale seals, but this involved 325,000 citizen scientists to review the imagery. In this context, automated detection comes as a possible solution, especially for animals in low densities over large areas, for example, the case of baleen whale migration routes. So with this in mind, I draw 5 different objectives. First, to conduct a review of methods and current challenges of automated detection of marine mammals in satellite and drone imagery. Then to assess the utility of developing a workflow to count marine mammals over water in red, green, blue drone imagery. To assess the utility of developing a workflow to extract the orientation of individuals to infer a marine mammal species migration route section direction in multispectral satellite imagery, to address how to develop a satellite image study to map marine mammal species migration routes, and finally, to examine the institutional framework and social aspects of the creation of an MPA to protect a baleen whale species along its migration route spanning the waters of different countries, as well as to address alternatives available for protection from collisions, entanglement, and noise pollution. This led to 7 dissertation chapters, which we will analyze shortly. Let's start by the review, which was published last year in PeerJ. We found 13 studies on automated detection of marine mammals ranging from 2013 to 2021, of which 5 used drone imagery and 8 used satellite imagery. Most studies use what we call pixel-based methods. These are methods that take individual pixels and classify them into, for example, whale or water classes, depending using the pixel's color or some texture variables. The early attempts in pixel-based methods use spectral information that is essentially color, but they weren't very successful. And in that sense, we agree with prior studies recommending methods that use more information, for example, geometrical information or textural information, such as deep learning or object-based image analysis. We'll get to those details shortly. Convolutional neural networks are an example of deep learning. They have been increasingly used to analyze satellite and drone imagery of whale and pinnipeds, that is seals, walrus, and sea lions. CNN, convolutional neural networks, have had mixed results so far, with relative success applied to whales. I also recognize object-based image analysis as a gap. Object-based image analysis does fall into the object-based methods. And unlike pixel-based methods, they work with homogeneous groups of pixels and then classify those groups of pixels, now being able to use more than just color. For example, the shape or the size of particular objects. I also paid attention to evaluation metrics, and classically, what one has is false negatives, animals missed, false positives, that is detections that are not animals, such as water or rock, but detected as animals. And this has been classically evaluated through recall and precision. But what we considered was that it was important to analyze false negatives and false positives on the total animals available for detection in the actual image to acquire a more reliable idea of how much of an overcount or an undercount the automated analysis would produce, especially in the context of a conservation planning application. So in this review, I use the false negative rate for an assessment of the undercount, the animals missed, the false positive over detectable rate to assess the false positives, and consolidated them into the automated count deviation as a unifying measure. So overall, I concluded that baleen whales have been the focus of automated studies. Studies on pinnipeds, sirenians, that is manatees and dugongs, and polar bears have followed, and studies on mustelids like sea otters or toothed whales like dolphins are due. Overall, the problem has been more related to the amount of false positives, not the animals missed. And in this context, with so many false positives, is where the possibility of semi-automation enters and becomes a reliable method to actually go through the detections and eliminate those false positives, still saving time. An example, Toombs et al., for example, still shortened the analysis time by doing a semi-automated approach by 96%. And I agree that with other studies that less costly imagery and software are necessary to drive the field forward. Let's go into chapter 3. This chapter follows the objective of assessing the utility of developing a workflow to detect marine mammals over drone imagery. And in this case, I chose the Florida manatee. The Florida manatee has suffered a recent mortality event at the Indian River Lagoon, highlighting the necessity for new abundance surveys. Drones can help by providing geolocated imagery to count them. However, there have only been automated studies on dugongs. And here we developed an OBIA workflow, an object-based image analysis workflow, to detect and count manatees in drone imagery over thermal refugia. The workflow was developed in Google Earth Engine, which is a cloud-based platform free for research, to make it more accessible. So we took two 10-minute stationary drone videos provided by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and an R code was put together to extract frames from those videos for training and testing data sets and automatically geolocate them. Testing and training data sets were used under a cross-validation approach. That is, the images from one video were used to train the workflow, and that workflow was evaluated in images of the other video, and vice versa. So the training proceeded with the segmentation step. We used the simple non-iterative clustering algorithm, which groups those pixels in those relatively homogeneous pixels into actual segments. Then the manatees were delineated manually by tracing a polygon over them and extracting the information from those segments on particular variables, which were used later in the classification in the testing part. The variables chosen were each band's mean, standard deviation, but also the area, the perimeter, the width, and the height of each segment. This is a complicated slide, so bear with me. The testing script followed essentially the same process described before for the segmentation. We had first the segmentation performed by a first function, which was followed by a second function, which took that segmentation and performed the classification using the training information from the other video. But then one thing is just to detect manatees, and another thing is to ask the computer to count them. To do that, a third function took the classification essentially took the segments that belong to the manatee class and unified them as long as they were in contact into a unique ID object. And a fourth function took those unique ID objects and converted them to vectors. They took them from the realm of just images and converted them to actual vectors to be able to count them. And it also placed centroids and markers over each detection. So for the results, we calculated accuracy metrics on two bases, per frame and per video. When we did it per frame, essentially we averaged in the end the frames within each video. For both ways of calculating the results, there were again few false negatives, few manatees missed, but more false positives. That is why the FPDR measure that you see there is always higher than the NFR. And sunglit, mud plumes, water close to shore, and the boat were confounding objects that contributed to the amount of false positives. Given the high amount of false positives, a semi-automated approach to use this workflow is recommendable. This study also aimed in general to drive the field forward by examining the capabilities of a particular free platform in a less explored taxon and in a less explored automated image analysis method. I concluded recommending also the inclusion of confounding object classes in future workflows, such as boats, mud plumes, and water by the shoreline and sunlit. Let's proceed on to the chapter number 4. As you may remember, the objective was to assess the utility of developing a workflow to extract the bearings of marine mammals over satellite imagery to see if we could contribute to future studies to map migration routes. I targeted gray whales, which have the longest migration of all baleen whales. Their feeding grounds are essentially between Alaska and Russia, and the calving grounds are go from Central California up to Bahia de Banderas, Jalisco. So it's a pretty remarkable migration they do. Some studies do suggest that the migration northbound or southbound may not always follow the coastline closely as was assumed before. Actually, a study by Sumich and Shou, of which you see the figure below, mapped a part of the migration route at the Southern California Bight by conducting aerial surveys and plotting the location of each whale along with its bearing, and with the aim of actually mapping the migration route, at least in that area. But surprisingly, what they found was that there wasn't a unique pathway. There were more than one corridor. And this could be the case in other areas along the migration route. So I acquired 3 sections of a satellite image of the first section, 31 square kilometers, the second 41, and the third 46 square kilometers from north to south, which you see in the map. And I manually found 27 confirmed whales across 16 different locations, all of them with the exception of one pointing southeast, and which suggested a migration behavior. For this particular chapter, I worked with a licensed software that would be eCognition, which is the go-to to do object-based image analysis. We started by a multi-resolution segmentation, and we used a k-fold approach by which the training from 2 of the images was used to test in the remaining image, and all the images were rotated in their function. So we manually selected samples among segments for 3 classes: whales, water, and confounding objects, which in this case, and you see them in the image below, were interpreted as seafoam mainly. The samples were exported together with their classification features, which in this case were the mean value of the green band, the standard deviation of one of the near-infrared bands, the border length of each segment, its length over width proportion, and an index of asymmetry. For testing, after segmentation, we trained a random forest classifier with the training data set. And finally, after the classification, we exported all remaining objects in the whale or the confounding class, or the confounding classes. There were whales and confounding. The export did include the object's orientation. So to quantify the classification accuracy, I applied a fuzzy logic by which detections, both detections from the confounding class and the whale class, were considered actual detections and were considered true positives as long as they overlaid an actual whale. Overall, the workflow only missed 2 whales, but on the other hand, the amount of false positives surpassed the number of true detections in the 3 images and many times over. In image 1, actually, it surpassed it by 3 orders of magnitude. So moreover, the detections of whales through the confounding object class actually surpassed the detection of whales through the class that was intended to detect them in the first place, at least in 2 of the images. I also assessed the amount of area to be surveyed in a semi-automated approach to go through each detection and discard the false positives. The good news is that despite the high amount of false positives, still the amount of area that would have to be surveyed to discard them is below 5% of the total imagery, compared to a complete manual detection with no automated method whatsoever. I also manually obtained the orientation of all the confirmed whales with ArcGIS Pro. In the cases where the measurements were done from head to tail instead of from tail to head, those were corrected by adding or subtracting 180 degrees. And we calculated the absolute difference with the manual measurements. Overall, the descriptive statistics essentially reflected the homogeneity in the direction that the whales were following. We had to conduct a test to evaluate how different were the measurements that were semi-automated with the manual ones. And the good news is that the scientists didn't find significant differences when 3 was the expected median in the null hypothesis. Overall, we had a 95% confidence interval, assessing that the difference between the semi-automated measurements of direction and the manual ones was between 2.68 degrees and 8.74 degrees, which is relatively positive for a first workflow trying to extract the bearings of migrating whales. Following Sumich and Show's study, we tried to essentially do a similar plotting, and what you see in the screen are the semi-automated measurements with that correction of the 180 degrees and the manual measurements of swimming direction. And again, we had few false negatives, but a high amount of false positives. It is possible that the use of a concurrent fuzzy logic by which you rescue whales detected on the confounding class, but combined with a semi-automated approach to discard the excess of false positives is a way to follow in the future. We had positive results in terms of how far away the real bearings were from the semi-automated measurement ones. The study still highlights the need for more coverage to effectively map a migration route. And again, even though we did a k-fold approach trying to alternate training and testing, these 3 images come from the same satellite image. So it's important to try in the future testing in a completely different satellite image with different sea conditions and different light conditions and different of nadir angle for the particular satellite. So let's now get to the following chapters, the chapters that are more related to marine protected areas. What we have here is that essentially the migratory habitat is no exception to the threats that marine mammals are facing nowadays, but there is little knowledge about their location, and that difficults the possibility of actually using marine protected areas to prevent those threats. So chapter 5 is dedicated to how to develop a satellite image study to map an actual migration route, and we'll use the gray whale study as a case study. In turn, the next chapter will be concerned with the institutional framework for the MPA creation and the particular regulations to prevent collisions, entanglement, and noise pollution. Speaking with the satellite image study, the observations of gray whales have gone up to 40 kilometers offshore. So for a satellite image study to actually map the migration route, it would be good to take the exclusive economic zones of the countries involved, that is Mexico, the US, and Canada, as essentially a good buffer, a good safety zone to be able to cover all of the migration phenomenon. And in terms of the limits north-south, it's possible to use El Vizcaíno Biosphere Reserve, which essentially contains the bulk of the calving grounds as a limit. And far up north, Chuhidanac Island is a good point to cut the study there as a limit with the feeding grounds. The total area, as you see in the map, would be close to 3 million square kilometers. And here comes the problem. Currently, private providers are offering, for example, WorldView 3 imagery at $27.5 the square kilometers, with an area of 3 million square kilometers. you're talking about $78 million just to get the images of the entire area one time. So what we first have is that to conduct this kind of study in the future, the price from private providers may still be too high for projects of this nature, taking the advantage of the vast satellite image coverage we have. Considering, for example, Pleiades Neo, a new constellation of satellites costed 700 million approximately. This does raise questions about a publicly owned satellite, because with that price, you would cover the area of study just 8 times. So, and that's something to consider in the future. And also the cost of a publicly owned satellite, if we take those 700 millions as a reference, would be approximately 2.29% of NASA's budgetary resources for the year of 2022. It does sound like a lot, but if there are contributions by different countries, and there are alternative uses for this kind of imagery, this could become something that we see in the future. Even uses like looking for illegal fishing or quantifying the calculation of fishing effort in conjunction with a better rate from private providers could make this kind of study more viable in the future. In terms of timing, there is considerable overlap between the northbound and the southbound migration. That's a problem of gray whales. So for this reason, the safest bet is to actually have imagery of the entire area of analysis during all months in which any migration takes place. And that means going through October through May. And now in terms of the actual mapping of migration routes, the detections of gray whales could be used to perform a density estimation, for instance, using point kernel density estimation to create density maps, from which potentially the overall width of the migration route could be established in map by finding the areas westwards and possibly eastwards where the density of whales migrating is 0 or close to 0. There could be individual corridors as those that Sumich and Shou found, and they could be mapped under the same principle. And the results of different months of imagery could essentially tell us which areas are unused ahead in the migration and which areas are unused before in the migration, therefore generating maps that highlight which corridors are active in particular months. So as a result, we would have maps for different months, highlighting those active corridors to use in conservation planning. Let's now go to chapter 6. Let's start by the institutional framework and the social aspects of the creation of an MPA. In the interest of time, we will leave the stakeholders and economic costs aside, but you can always contact me by email if you have any questions or if you are interested. So MPAs within a country's waters can be created with local, state, provincial, or national approval under the law. There are regional treaties and international agreements and organizations that can assist in MPA creation. And just recently, we have actually a legally binding instrument agreed by the UN to actually create marine protected areas in international waters. In our particular case, the 3 countries involved could sign an agreement on the intent to create an MPA and conduct an initial study. And after that, after the study and agreeing on the regulations, a new binding treaty could be signed to ensure homogeneous regulations across the waters of the 3 countries. In the United States, according to NOAA, there are different types of MPAs that can be created with different local, state, tribal, or federal authorities. And within the federal authorities, we find the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, among others, as capable authorities of creating marine protected areas. While the first two might appear more targeted towards our case study, the truth is that the current conservation status of gray whales does not kickstart the process within the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, for which the Marine Sanctuaries Act would be more appropriate to kickstart the creation of a marine protected area for this species in particular, if we wanted to. But always keep in mind, this is just a case study to model the creation of a marine protected area, but this could be applied to other species. And for those, the Endangered Species Act or the Marine Mammal Protection Act would be possibly very relevant. So the National Marine Sanctuaries Act puts the day-to-day management of said marine protected area within NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. In Canada, there is already, within the Oceans Act, there is a system for which to create marine protected areas. It's known as Governing Council regulations. Just recently, the Oceans Act was amended to include something called ministerial order, which allows to freeze the human footprint in an area that is being considered to become a marine protected area in the future. And in the case of Mexico, the instrument of environmental policy with the highest level of juridical definition for conservation is that of protected areas, which can be terrestrial or aquatic. And they are created by presidential decree or by the certification of a particular area whose owners decide to dedicate for conservation. The National Commission of Protected Areas administers currently 186 federally protected natural areas, of which 31 extend over terrestrial and marine environments, and 6 are exclusively marine. And let's proceed now to the marine protected area regulations to prevent collisions, entanglement, and noise pollution. So, in terms of collisions, according to a very good article, Silver et al., that summarizes this, the policies available are limited. We have education policies to provide maritime industries on collisions threat to whales. We have the possibility of providing whale location information in order to facilitate whale avoidance. But time and area-based either speed or complete traffic restrictions are the only kind of policies that thus far count with reliable evidence to support their effectiveness in preventing collisions. The International Maritime Organization, which is a specialized agency within the UN and the only one authorized under SOLAS to be able to establish ships routing to be able to establish ships routing measures, plays an important role as generally compliance from the industry with IMO approved measures is generally high. So with this in mind, any alternatives within an MPA in terms of regulations to prevent collisions would benefit from IMO approval. And within the options, we certainly have rerouting from active corridors, but a less stringent alternative is just to mandate a speed reduction, for example, to 10 knots, which is the GOAT in this case, and the establishment, for example, of an MSR, that is a mandatory ship reporting system by which a ship provides waypoints of its route and receives in turn updating information on whale location and procedural guidance to avoid strikes. In terms of entanglement, the National Marine Fisheries Service reported that gillnet and trap and pot fisheries were commonly associated with gray whales. This kind of fisheries were also found to be related to gray whale entanglements further up north. So as a result, we have again a set of limited alternatives. Within the most stringent scenario, we can do spatiotemporal closures, right? We can close the migration corridors to gillnet and trap and pot fisheries to prevent entanglements of any kind. In this scenario, the sections of active migration corridors would remain close to those fisheries within the time in which they are active. But on the other hand, a less stringent alternative is, for example, to put in motion Oregon Sea Grants recommendations, which were done for the Dungeness crab fishery in mind, especially. And those include gear marking and registration, all of this aiming to not lose them and leave them at the sea where they keep entangling whales. The elimination of grace periods to retrieve pots after the season has been closed, pot limits, and encouraging the recovery of derelict gear, that is abandoned gear or lost gear. Additionally, another less stringent measure would be that both gillnet and trap fisheries could rely on modified gear use within the MPA as options with within the less stringent spectrum of measures. One option is to use pingers and collar ropes. Pingers are gadgets that produce sounds that hopefully deter whales. There is, however, a need for more conservative research to find the right pingers or collars that deter gray whales but do not attract other species of whales, which would just increase the entanglement problem. Weekend gear for traps, pots, and gillnets are another option of modified gear. But finally, again, an alternative in the middle would be to have closure to classically used trap and pot and gillnet fisheries on the active corridors, and in turn the option of having ropeless gear at those corridors, mainly mediated right now by an experimental program. Ropeless gear, researching ropeless gear is being done. But it's taking time, and right now most of the use is within the realms of an experimental program. For this, we have the Northeast Fisheries Science Center experimental program. We will not get into the details, but essentially it counts with a gear library because currently ropeless gear is particularly expensive. It counts on exempted fishing permits, essentially because the law requires for you to mark the gear to prevent conflicts among fishers. And it consists of 4 particular steps. There is a technology developing and testing step. There is a testing geolocation software to reduce gear conflict, because let's keep in mind that when ropeless gear doesn't have a buoy on top, no one knows where it's at, and essentially the fishers will not know who's fishing where. The step number 3 would be scaling up testing gear volume, and step number 4 would update the regulatory frameworks to allow for the use of ropeless fishing gear. With this in mind, let's jump into another subject, noise pollution. Noise pollution can be created by naval sonar, and navies around the world do tend to self-regulate, but this is not always compulsory. However, a good example is that of the Spanish Navy around the Canary Islands. They have placed a 15 nautical mile exclusion area to not conduct naval sonar in that particular exclusion zone. However, 50 nautical miles is a considerable chunk of exclusive economic zone. So with that in mind, it is possible to use precedents from other navies. For example, the US Navy has a court order to use 12 nautical miles exclusion zone placed in 2008. The Italian Navy uses a 5-kilometer buffer to conduct naval sonar exercises. And the Canadian Navy uses a 1-kilometer exclusion zone, but essentially it's only taken into account once a whale enters that area to stop the procedure, not to, otherwise they would continue as long as there weren't whales in that particular area. In terms, also seismic surveys, Ergan seismic surveys do contribute to much of the noise pollution that affects marine mammals. And the options essentially rely on area closures and avoidance in time of key marine mammal habitat. And essentially that kind of measure has been recognized as the most effective one. The strategy I followed was to essentially review the literature in terms of buffer zones that are put in place around seismic surveys and use it in turn to suggest buffers around migration corridors. So on the milder set of options for regulation, there are what we call operational procedures. As soon as a particular, let's imagine that one survey is being conducted within a migration corridor, as soon as a whale appears within a certain buffer area, you would stop the procedure. But then we could, again, use the buffers that were established in the past around Ergan surveys to actually create exclusion zones around migration corridors. And in those terms, the literature for different species gives us some precedents: 500 meters, 1 kilometer, 3 kilometers. In particular, for gray whales, we have a precedent of 4 to 5 kilometers of buffer area used in the Sakhalin Island. However, these are all essentially, the problem with these options is that they were all based on different species at particular places and not necessarily keeping in mind the real effects on the animals. So for that reason, it would be important that in the future, more concerted research is carried out to actually establish perhaps buffers that are targeted towards a particular acoustic environment and to particular sizes of Ergan arrays, essentially, because the buffer you need depends on the equipment that you are using for a particular seismic survey. And in terms of ship noise, an interesting aspect of the literature I could find did rely on speed reduction, and as long as pitch propellers, fixed pitch propellers, as long as we are talking about ships with as long as we were talking about ships with fixed pitch propellers, if not controllable pitch propellers with speed reduction would actually create more noise. But essentially, most of the literature relied on that as a measure. But there was also the interesting literature developing the concept of listening space reduction, and this is again more from the standpoint of the particular animals. Listening space reduction is essentially the masking effect because of ship noise. And on bowhead whales, which have an overlap frequency calls with gray whales, the LSR has been found to be reduced to just 50% when the source of noise was 30 kilometers apart. And this is essentially visual analysis of the maps that you see here from a particular study, Pine et al. So with this in mind, the suggestions, again, the regulations already suggested to prevent ship strikes could be helping in reducing ship noise, but there are more stringent alternatives available. We could have a spatio-temporal closure of the equivalent to the 30 kilometers. That would be around 16 nautical miles, but that's again a considerable chunk of the exclusive economic zone not being able to be used for traffic. So as an alternative, another study, Williams et al. Found that in the Haro Strait, 1 to 4 kilometers distance from a ship did reduce noise by 3 decibels. But again, these measures are from studies in specific circumstances and not necessarily with the species of interest. So again, to in the future establish reliable buffer zones, it's necessary to conduct concerted research around the species of interest. So in this chapter, we proposed alternatives for regulations for ship strikes, entanglement, and noise pollution based on the available literature. In most cases, there was a reliance on area-based exclusion, but in a few times, we were able to find promising measures that did not entail the absolute exclusion of anthropogenic activities, such as speed reduction, the MSR, or the ropeless fishing gear experimental program. And again, I would stress the need for more concerted research because when establishing this kind of restrictions, it's necessary to have specialized data in the species of interest to actually balance anthropogenic activities with effective conservation and effective protection of the species of interest. Overview. In this dissertation, we have been able to assess the state of the field. We have been able to make advancements in the use of object-based image analysis. We have been able to test its implementation in a free platform. And we have been able to essentially find a new application of semi-automated detection to study migration routes. And this was integrated into a policy blueprint. However, many topics in automated detection remain. It's certainly necessary to have more development of object-based image analysis workflow because with the amount of false positives that we have from this dissertation, we are still locked down to a semi-automated use. And then we need also workflows that differentiate species. There are some workflows that differentiate species, but that's definitely a capability that allows you to apply these workflows in the field where you'll find more than one species, most likely. This dissertation also has the limitations of not having dealt with marine mammals over land on ice, which is a very relevant scenario for pinnipeds and polar bears. And again, studies on mustelids and toothed whales are due. The cost of imagery and software still pose important hurdles to the advancement of the field, and also just the lack of offshore coverage, which if increased could have other uses like monitoring illegal fishing and monitoring other taxa. So with this in mind, I wanted to thank my committee, the School of Natural Resources and Environment, and the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences, and the Robin Inato Fund, and the Cynthia A. Melnick Endowment Fund, as well as a long list of people that have helped me in one way or another through these 4 years. Thank you.
We are just Get my microphone working. Okay, so we are just a little bit over time. So if there's any questions for from our Zoom people, now would be a great time to jump in.
Any questions? Oh, yeah, I have one question here.
Well, I have three questions. Yeah. The first one is something for curiosity about the temporal scale of the satellite images. Maybe it's something difficult, no, to get the information for mammals that they have their own activity patterns. So could you talk more about the temporal scale?
Yeah,
Thank you.
we didn't talk about that in this presentation because it would have been very long, but satellites, let me see if I have something useful here to explain that. Satellites, here we are. This one. There are satellites with a north-south orbit, and essentially as the Earth rotates, they keep orbiting in that direction and covering different areas of the Earth. But for example, WorldView 3 has a 4-day revisit time of the same place in the same position, right? So that's a challenge. However, when analyzing an area as large as this migration route, it's not that you're necessarily following a particular whale and you want it again. You wouldn't be able necessarily to recognize it. But what you need is essentially the coverage of what I estimate it's necessary to at least have an idea of the maps that you could create for this migration route is the coverage of the entire migration route once a month during the relevant months, right? So that's feasible. That's feasible. Sure, some areas of the migration route will be covered with 4 days of difference, but that wouldn't make that necessarily that much of a change because this is a process that takes 2 months for these wells to go from point A to point B. But that's the problem. Right now, what I see in the satellite industry is that the paradigm is shifting. They are relying on constellations, that is more than one satellite. That is the case of Pleiades Neo, I believe. And in that sense, they are able to have less of what we call a revisit time and be able to essentially go back to the same place, perhaps with another satellite, not the same one, but it doesn't matter because it has the same capabilities in a shorter period of time. But it is challenging, right? It's definitely challenging.
Thank you so much. And I forgot to say that this is an amazing work, so congratulations. And also with the gray whales, so do you can identify segments with high uncertainty, and maybe you could identify if it is a whale or not, but visually, do you think it is possible?
I actually have to do it because it's the only way I can create. Essentially, I have to do it manually first myself and find those whales in those images to actually see how well the workflow actually performs. Essentially, I take my visual analysis as the correct answer, essentially, and then I see if the workflow found that particular whale there or not. That's how it works, but it's very time consuming.
Yeah, of course.
Very time consuming.
And the last one, sorry, is about Mexico, because I'm from Mexico, so I'm really interested in the protected areas in Mexico, marine protected areas.
Yes.
We have a huge or several protected areas in really huge, some of them. But I was reading something about that they protect below 800 meters deep in the sea. So what's your opinion about that? because they are not protecting the superficial sea.
Well, that's the problem in particular with gray whales, right? I don't know, I would have to check if for example, we have El Vizcaíno Biosphere Reserve, which protects several calving grounds, right, of gray whales. I would have to check, the fine letter in terms of whether in juridical terms, you are protecting just the surface or you are actually protecting everything below. My guess is that probably it doesn't specify, but and that's a problem. The problem of protecting what happens below, it's an issue with gray whales, essentially, because they feed in a very particular way. They just go to the bottom and essentially roll over the ocean, the bottom surface, and they filter out whatever they find there in the benthic community. So that's what makes them particularly prone to getting entangled in traps and pots of fisheries that are trying to catch crab. And essentially they have, for example, a cage here, and they have a line that connects that cage with a buoy and other cages. And when they do this rolling behavior on the bottom surface, they get entangled in all the equipment. However, the way in which a marine protected area would work, as far as I imagine, is that independently of necessarily specifying that the column of water is protected, when they say that you cannot deploy traps and pots in this particular area, they are automatically preventing the possibility of those pots being there in the first place. But it's a good point. Perhaps it's something that we should evaluate and see if it's not already included, especially for gray whales.
Thank you again. That was really wonderful. Thank you to everybody on Zoom. I will see you here again on next Monday. For anybody else who has additional questions, feel free to stay and hang out. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, you did. Yeah, I don't know, because she's been like logging on.
Hi.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was long.
Wow, it's a lot. I'm very.
Had to cut so much, but I mean, you're gonna put everything.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah,
Really,
yeah.
really nice.
So-
Yeah.
Some points of cutting were painful, like, because there were so many, little terms that could confuse everyone. Like, I mean, I could have spent some time describing what ropeless gear was. I did it, but very succinctly, like I was concerned about that. There is,